The granite was cold under my fingertips, a stark contrast to the unseasonably warm November sun. It had been exactly 1 year. 1 year since I had stood in the same spot, watching them lower my mother's casket into the earth. The inscription on the headstone was simple, just as she had been. Eleanor May Peterson, beloved wife and mother. I traced the letters of her name, the silence of the cemetery broken only by the rustling of dry leaves. My phone vibrated in my pocket, a jarring intrusion of the modern world into this quiet place of memory. I ignored it. It buzzed again, insistent. With a sigh, I pulled it out. It was a text from my wife, Isabel. I can't do this anymore. I've moved my things out. My lawyer will be in touch. Don't come back to the house tonight. I need space. I read the words once, then a second time. They were clinical, efficient, devoid of any emotion save for a cold, clear finality. There was no "I'm sorry," no "we need to talk," just a directive, a termination of services. She had chosen this day, this exact moment, while I was standing at my mother's grave, to detonate our 20-year marriage. It was a calculated act of cruelty, designed for maximum psychological impact, a move to throw me off balance, to shatter my composure, to make me emotional, and therefore weak. For a long moment, I felt nothing. The grief for my mother and the shock of my wife's betrayal seemed to cancel each other out, leaving a strange, hollow void. Then, a different feeling began to coalesce in that emptiness. It wasn't rage. It wasn't despair. It was a quiet, cold, and deeply familiar sense of professional focus. The feeling I get when a client brings me a complex system on the brink of catastrophic failure. My name is Thomas Peterson, 52 years old, and for the last 30 years, I have been a risk management consultant. My specialty is institutional failure. I work with banks, insurance companies, and corporations. They hire me to look at their most critical systems and find the hidden vulnerabilities, the single points of failure, the black swan events they don't see coming. I stress test fortresses for a living. I find the cracks in the foundation before the earthquake hit. And I had known, for some time now, that my own foundation was deeply compromised. My mother's death had been a brutal, painful education. Watching her slow decline, managing her affairs, I had been forced to confront the fragility of life, of systems, of carefully laid plans. After she was gone, I turned that same analytical, unsentimental gaze onto my own life. I ran a full risk assessment on my marriage. The results were not good. The primary liability was my wife, Isabel. I had seen the warning signs, the increasing dismissiveness of my work, the new expensive friends, the subtle, growing contempt for our quiet, comfortable life. The way she looked at me, not as a partner, but as a utility, a well-funded, reliable utility, but a utility nonetheless. She saw a quiet, predictable man who provided a beautiful home and a limitless credit card, a man who was too busy, too boring, too wrapped up in his spreadsheets and reports to notice her machinations. She had made a critical error. She had mistaken my quiet nature for weakness, and my methodical approach for a lack of sophistication. She thought she was playing chess against a man who only knew how to play checkers. What she didn't know was that 6 months ago, after my full risk assessment was complete, I had quietly and methodically implemented a comprehensive mitigation strategy. I had stress-tested my own life, and had found it wanting. So I had rebuilt it. I had created a fortress. The text message was not the beginning of a new war. It was simply the triggering event for a contingency plan that was already in place. Isabel thought she had just launched a surprise attack. She had no idea she had just walked, willingly and arrogantly, into a trap of her own making. The thing that was waiting for her at home wasn't anger or a desperate plea for reconciliation. It was a quiet, unbreachable, and legally airtight system of consequences. I put my phone back in my pocket. I looked at my mother's grave one last time. "I learned from the best, Mom," I whispered to the cold stone. "You always told me to be prepared." I turned and walked away from the grave, my footsteps steady on the gravel path. I did not drive to a friend's house. I did not go to a hotel. I drove home, to the house she had told me not to return to the house that, Unbeknownst to her, she no longer had any claim to. The diagnostic phase was over. The system was now live. The drive home was quiet. I didn't play music. I let the silence be a space for thought, for organizing the flow of information, and planning the next steps. My grief for my mother was a low, steady hum beneath the surface. But the immediate problem, the Isabel situation, was a clear, sharp signal that demanded my full analytical attention. I pulled into the driveway of the large stone house we had lived in for 15 years. It was a beautiful home, a place I had always found peace in. Tonight, it felt like a client site after a security breach, a place to be assessed and secured. The first thing I noticed was that her car was gone. Good. That simplified things. I used my key to open the front door. The entrance hall, usually decorated with a large, vibrant abstract painting she had bought at a charity auction, was bare. A pale rectangle on the wall, marked where it had. The house was cold and silent, but it was a different silence from the one I had left that morning. It was a hollow, empty silence. I walked through the downstairs rooms. She had been thorough. The silver candlesticks from the dining room were gone. The collection of antique maps from my study had been taken. Small, valuable, easily transportable items. In the living room, a note was propped on the mantelpiece. It was on the thick, cream-colored letterhead of a law firm I didn't recognize. I picked it up. It was a letter from her new lawyer, a man named Marcus Thorne. It was a masterpiece of legal aggression. It outlined her demands: sole possession of the primary residence, half of my business, a significant buyout from my investment portfolio, and lifetime alimony. The letter was filled with phrases like emotional neglect, financial disparity, and contribution to the marital estate. It was a work of fiction, a carefully crafted narrative designed to paint her as the wronged party, and me as an emotionally stunted dragon sitting on a pile of gold. I folded the letter and put it in my pocket. It was a data point. It confirmed the vector of her attack. She was aiming for a shock and awe legal strategy, hoping to overwhelm me into a quick, generous settlement. I went upstairs. Our bedroom had been ransacked. Her closets were empty. Her jewelry box, which had contained pieces I had bought for her over 20 years, was gone. She had even taken the expensive linens from the bed. She hadn't just moved out. She had looted the place. I stood in the middle of the room, not with a sense of personal violation, but with the cool detachment of an insurance adjuster. I began to make a mental inventory. This was not a sentimental exercise. It was a legal one. I needed to document what she had taken. A memory surfaced, a flashback to about 8 months ago, not long after my mother's funeral. I had been working late in my study. Isabel came in, a glass of wine in her hand. She perched on the edge of my desk. "Thomas, you work so hard," she'd said, her tone a mixture of pity and condescension. "All these numbers and charts. It's so tedious. Don't you ever want to just live?" "My work allows us to live very well, Isabel," I had replied, not looking up from my screen. "But it's not a life, is it?" she'd pressed. "It's a balance sheet. Our house is an asset. Our friends are contacts. Our marriage is a merger." At the time I had dismissed it as a moment of existential ennui on her part. I see now she wasn't making a philosophical point. She was telling me exactly how she saw the world, and she was projecting her own transactional worldview onto me. She believed that because I was methodical, I was also passionless. Because I was quiet, I was unfeeling. She had diagnosed me as a simple, predictable system, and she had built her entire exit strategy around that flawed assessment. It was the single greatest mistake she would ever make. I walked back to my study. The antique maps were gone, but my computers, my servers, my work, the real source of my wealth, were untouched. She didn't see value in them. They were just the tedious tools of my tedious trade. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. It was time to activate the contingency plan. My plan wasn't a single action, but a cascade of prearranged, legally binding events, all triggered by a single secure email. I opened a specific encrypted mail client. I typed a single phrase into the body of the email: "Execute Nightingale Protocol." The recipient list was small and precise. Ms. Anya Davies, my personal and corporate lawyer; David Chen, the managing partner of the private trust company I had engaged, and the security manager for my primary bank. I hit send. The system was now live. Within minutes, a series of things would happen. A hold would be placed on the joint credit cards that were technically in my name. The locks on the house would be remotely deactivated, and a security team would be dispatched to rekey the entire property within the hour. But the most important part of the protocol was the one she would discover later, the part that was waiting for her, the part that would dismantle her entire legal strategy before it even began. 6 months ago, I had undertaken a complete restructuring of my assets. The house she thought we owned jointly, the business she thought I owned personally, the investment portfolio she was planning to raid, they had all been transferred. I was no longer the owner. They were now the sole property of an irrevocable, ironclad entity known as the Nightingale Family Trust, a trust of which I was the managing director, but not the sole beneficiary, and a trust of which Isabel was not a beneficiary at all. She thought she was divorcing a man. She was about to find out she was suing a fortress. The concept of the Nightingale Family Trust had been born from a conversation with my mother a few months before she passed. She was in a lucid moment, her mind clear and sharp, and we were discussing her will. "Thomas," she'd said, her voice thin but firm, "your father was a good man, but he was a terrible businessman. He left me with a mess. I had to learn to protect myself, to build walls. You're like me. You're a builder, but your greatest vulnerability is your quiet heart. You assume the best in people." She had looked at me with a deep, knowing sadness. "Isabel is not a builder, Thomas. She's a decorator. She finds a solid structure and adds expensive curtains, but she doesn't understand the foundation. Be careful she doesn't try to sell the fixtures when she thinks you're not looking." The conversation had stayed with me. It was a warning from the person who knew me best. After her death, I took her words to heart. My risk assessment of my marriage was just that, an analysis of the foundation, and I had found it to be rotten. I went to see a lawyer, but not a divorce lawyer. I went to see the best estate and asset protection lawyer in the state, a woman my firm had on retainer for our high net worth clients. Her name was Anya Davies. She was a woman in her 60s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a mind like a steel trap. I laid out the situation for her, not as a husband with a failing marriage, but as a client with a significant liability issue. I presented her with my financial statements and my risk assessment report. "My primary liability," I concluded, "is a partner who has a vested interest in the catastrophic failure of the enterprise and who is actively working to undermine its stability for personal gain." Anya had read my report, her expression unreadable. When she was finished, she looked up at me. "Mr. Peterson," she said, "in 30 years of practice, this is the most thorough and chilling risk assessment of a marriage I have ever seen. You are absolutely correct. Your exposure is total." We spent the next month working together. She was the architect. I was the engineer. Together, we designed the Nightingale Trust. It was not a simple legal entity. It was a fortress, with layers of legal protection that were, in her words, as close to impregnable as the law allows. First, we transferred ownership of my company. I was no longer the sole owner. I was now an employee, the CEO of my own firm, which was owned by the trust. My salary was substantial, but my personal assets were now separated from the company's value. Next, the house. We discovered that when we had bought it 15 years ago, the deed had been put solely in my name, a clerical oversight at the time that was about to become a critical firewall. We transferred the deed to the trust. I was now a resident, not an owner. The vast majority of my liquid assets, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, were also moved into the trust portfolio. I was left with a generous personal checking account and a salary. I was comfortable, but I was no longer on paper a wealthy man. The masterstroke of the trust was its beneficiary structure. The primary beneficiaries were not me, but my 2 grown children from my first marriage, and a series of charitable foundations my mother had supported. I was the managing director, with the legal authority to manage the trust's assets, but I was not the owner of them. The final piece was the triggering event clause. We drafted a clause that stated that in the event of a legal action being filed against me for divorce, a series of automatic protections would be enacted. All joint accounts would be frozen, a full audit of all spending for the last 24 months would be initiated, and a formal notification would be sent to all relevant parties,
clarifying the trust's ownership of the primary assets. The email I had sent from my car was the legal trigger for that clause. Now as I sat in my study, the responses began to come. An email from David Chen at the trust company. Nightingale Protocol, confirmed and executed. All notifications sent. Security team dispatched to your location. An email from my bank's security chief. All designated accounts have been secured as per the standing order. Awaiting further instructions from the trust. And finally a call from Anya Davies. Thomas, she said, her voice calm and professional. The system is live. I've already received a panicked call from a Mr. Marcus Thorne. He seems to be under the impression that his client is married to a man of significant personal wealth. And what did you tell him? I asked. I told him that his client is married to an employee of a trust, she replied, and I could hear the smile in her voice. I informed him that my client's personal assets are modest, and that the house his client is currently claiming possession of is the property of the Nightingale Trust, which has a zero-tolerance policy for trespassers. I suggested he reevaluate his client's position and get back to me with a more realistic proposal. The opening salvo had been fired, but it wasn't the one Isabel and her lawyer had been expecting. They had come expecting to lay siege to a wealthy kingdom. They had just discovered that the king lived in a small, well-defended castle, and the kingdom they were trying to conquer was owned by an entity that did not negotiate. The next few days were quiet. The security team arrived and rekeyed the entire house. They were discreet, professional, and had the quiet competence of men who were used to dealing with high-stakes situations. I began the process of cleaning, of restoring order to the chaos Isabel had left behind. I packed up her remaining belongings, the things she had not deemed valuable enough to loot, into boxes. I was not sentimental. I was performing a system purge. I knew this was just the first stage. Isabel and her lawyer were not the type to give up easily. They would regroup, re-strategize, and attack again. They would try to find a crack in the fortress walls. But I had built those walls. I knew every joint, every stone, every line of legal code that held them together. They could lay siege all they wanted. The fortress would hold. The first counterattack came a week later. It was a formal legal motion filed by Thorne, Isabel's lawyer. It was an audacious, desperate document. He was petitioning the court to have the Nightingale Trust declared a fraudulent conveyance, arguing that I had created it solely to hide marital assets in anticipation of the divorce. It was the only move he had, the legal equivalent of a Hail Mary pass. Anya Davies was not impressed. We met in her office, a calm, book-lined space that exuded a quiet authority. "This is predictable," she said, tapping the motion with her pen. "It's a standard tactic when one party has been outmaneuvered. He will argue that you acted in bad faith. Our job is to prove that you acted with prudence." "And how do we do that?" I asked. "We use your own methodology against them," she said with a thin smile. "You are a risk management consultant. Your entire professional life is about identifying and mitigating future risks. We will argue that you did exactly what any prudent individual in your position would do. You saw a potential liability, and you took steps to insure against it. The fact that the liability turned out to be your wife is unfortunate for her, but it is not illegal. The key," she explained, "was the timing. I had created the trust 6 months before Isabel had filed for divorce. We had the documentation, the meeting logs, the correspondence. We could prove that the trust was not a reaction to the divorce, but a preemptive, strategic decision based on a formal risk assessment. My own professional paranoia was about to become my greatest legal defense. And we have your mother's testimony in a sense," Anya added. "What do you mean?" "Your mother's illness and death," she clarified. "It was a significant life event. We will argue that it was the catalyst that forced you to confront your own mortality and the stability of your affairs. It is a perfectly reasonable and sympathetic narrative. A man, grieving the loss of his mother, and confronted with the fragility of life, takes responsible steps to put his house in order. Who could argue with that?" She was brilliant. She was taking my cold, analytical process and wrapping it in a warm, human narrative
that a judge would find compelling. While Anya prepared our legal response, I began my own deep dive. The trust's auditors were already conducting a full review of all my finances, a process I had initiated myself. But I wanted to look at Isabel's spending. As part of the divorce proceedings, both parties are required to provide financial disclosure. Her preliminary disclosure, which Thorne had attached to his motion, was a work of artful omission. It listed her personal bank account, a few credit cards, and not much else. It was time to run my own audit. I still had access to years of our shared digital history. I began by analyzing the joint credit card statements from the 2 years before the split. I was looking for patterns. I found one almost immediate, a series of regular, high-value purchases from high-end men's clothing stores, luxury watch dealers, and expensive restaurants, where I had never dined. These were not her usual spending habits. The purchases were often made in a city about 100 miles away. Then I cross-referenced the dates of these purchases with our shared digital calendar. On almost every occasion, Isabel had told me she was going on a spa weekend with her friends or visiting a sick aunt. A memory surfaced, a flashback to about a year ago. She had come home from one of her spa weekends, glowing and relaxed. She'd bought me a new, expensive watch. "Just a little something to show you I was thinking of you," she'd said. I looked at the credit card statement from that weekend. The watch was, but so was a charge for $3,000 from a men's bespoke tailor in the same city. The watch wasn't a gift, it was a cover, a piece of misdirection to distract from a much larger expense. She wasn't just having an affair, she was funding another man's entire lifestyle with my money. This changed the narrative significantly. Her claim to alimony and a share of the marital assets was based on the idea that she was the financially dependent spouse. The evidence I was uncovering proved that she was actively diverting marital funds to a third party. This was not just infidelity, it was a form of financial fraud. I created a detailed spreadsheet, a timeline of her secret life, every suspicious charge, every corresponding lie from our shared calendar. It was a cold, brutal, and irrefutable picture of her deception. I sent the file to Anya. Her reply was swift. "Thomas, this is devastating. This doesn't just destroy her claim for support. It opens her up to a potential claim for dissipation of marital assets. We can sue her to get the money back." "I don't want the money back," I told her. "I just want this to be over. I want her out of my life." "I understand," Anya said. "But we will hold this in reserve. It is our nuclear option. We won't use it unless we have to. For now, we stick to the plan. We defend the integrity of the trust. We let Thorne waste his client's money attacking a fortress he cannot breach." And so we did. For the next 2 months, we were engaged in a slow, grinding legal battle. Thorne filed motion after motion. We responded to each one with calm, factual, and legally airtight brief. It was a war of attrition, and we had all the ammunition. Isabel was likely bleeding money, paying her high-priced lawyer to fight a losing battle. I, on the other hand, was insulated. The trust was paying for my legal defense. It was another feature we had designed. The fortress was not only defending itself, it was funding its own defense. During this time, I focused on my own restoration. I had the entire house repainted, in shades of gray and blue that I found calming. I turned one of the empty guest rooms into a personal gym. I bought a new painting for the entrance hall, a serene landscape that reminded me of my childhood home. I was systematically purging Isabel's influence, her taste, her presence, from the space. I was reclaiming my home. I knew a confrontation was inevitable. Thorne would eventually realize he could not win on the legal merits, and would push for a settlement meeting. He would try to use intimidation and bluster to achieve what he could not achieve through the law. I began to prepare for that meeting, not with legal briefs, but with a quiet, mental resolve. I had the facts, I had the evidence, and I had a story to tell. A story of a quiet man who had been underestimated one too many times. A story that was about to reach its final chapter. The call for a 4-way settlement meeting came, as predicted, after 2 of Thorne's preliminary motions were unceremoniously dismissed by the court. He was making no headway, and his client was likely growing impatient and financially strained. He framed the meeting as a good faith effort to find a reasonable path forward. Anya and I knew it was a last-ditch effort to salvage something from the wreckage. Anya insisted the meeting take place at her office. We control the territory, she'd say. No theatrical stunts on their home ground. On the day of the meeting, I felt a calm resolve. I was not the same man who had stood stunned and heartbroken at my mother's grave 3 months ago. The process of uncovering the truth and building my defense had forged something new in me. The quiet heart my mother had worried about was still there, but it was now encased in a layer of cold, hard-won experience. Isabel and Thorne arrived looking strained. The arrogant confidence was gone, replaced by a brittle, defensive anger. Isabel refused to look at me, her gaze fixed on a point on the far wall. Thorne started the meeting with a weak attempt at his old bluster. "Anya, Thomas," he began, "my client is prepared to be reasonable. She is willing to forego any claim on the business. But the house, the shared investments, these are marital assets. The trust is a clear legal fiction, and we are prepared to litigate that to the highest court." Anya let him finish. She didn't interrupt. When he was done, she simply slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a summary of the estimated legal costs for a prolonged court battle to contest the trust. The number was well into the 7 figures. "You can certainly try, Marcus," she said, her voice soft but laced with steel. "But your client will be bankrupt long before you get a preliminary hearing. The trust, on the other hand, has a litigation budget that is, for all practical purposes, unlimited. So you can either spend the next 5 years and millions of your client's non-existent dollars fighting a losing battle, or we can discuss reality." Thorne's face tightened. He had no response. It was a checkmate he couldn't escape. "The reality," Anya continued, "is that your client is entitled to 50% of the assets that were accumulated in the marriage and are not protected by the trust. That amounts to the contents of a joint checking account, which currently holds $17,000, and she is entitled to half, or $8,500, and 2 of the wheels." The insult was so profound, so dismissive, it was almost beautiful. Isabel finally broke her silence. Her voice was a low, trembling hiss of fury. "This is insane. I gave you 20 years of my life, Thomas. I built a home for you, a social life. I managed our lives. That has value." "I agree," I said, speaking for the first time. My voice was quiet, but it cut through her rising anger. "Your contributions had value, and they were compensated. You were provided with a beautiful home, a luxury car, unlimited access to funds for clothing, travel, and entertainment. You lived a life of leisure and comfort, a life you did not have to work for. That was the arrangement." Then, I looked directly at her. "But that arrangement was based on a partnership, and you violated the terms of that partnership." Anya slid a second document across the table. This one was thicker. It was the spreadsheet I had created. "This," she said to Thorne, "is a preliminary audit of Peterson's spending over the last 24 months. It details over $200,000 in marital funds that were diverted to a third party, a Mr. Alistair Finch. We have receipts for bespoke suits, luxury vacations you took together, and even rent payments for his apartment in the city." I saw a flicker of recognition in Isabel's eyes at the name. Alistair Finch, the man she had been funding, the man she was likely planning to leave me for. "This isn't just infidelity, Marcus," Anya said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "This is dissipation of marital assets. It's financial fraud. If we were to pursue this, we would not be discussing what Thomas owes Isabel. We would be discussing what Isabel owes the trust. And I assure you, it is a debt she cannot afford to pay." Isabel stared at the spreadsheet, at the cold, hard facts of her secret life laid bare. Every lie, every spa weekend, every hidden transaction, all neatly organized in columns and rows. It was the story of her betrayal, told in the language of a balance sheet. The language she had accused me of being obsessed with was now the language of her own undoing. She looked up at me, her face a mask of desperation and hatred. "You were always watching, weren't you?" she whispered. The quiet man in his study, judging everything. "No, Isabel," I said, and this was the most important truth of all. "I wasn't watching. I trusted you.
I only started looking when you gave me a reason to. You handed me a problem. I am a professional problem solver. This is the solution. I stood up. Ania, I believe we're done here. I turned and walked out of the room. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I had run the final diagnostic. The system had been purged of its corruption. The restoration was complete. The aftermath was not a dramatic explosion, but a quiet, inexorable crumbling. Faced with the twin threats of a ruinously expensive legal battle she couldn't win, and a countersuit for financial fraud she couldn't defend, Isabel capitulated completely. She signed the settlement agreement Ania had prepared. She walked away with $8,500 and a used Lexus. Her lawyer, Marcus Thorne, having been so thoroughly and publicly dismantled, saw his reputation as a legal shark suffer a significant blow. The story of the impenetrable trust made the rounds in the city's legal circles, a cautionary tale for aggressive divorce attorneys. Isabel, stripped of the wealth and status that had been the foundation of her identity, disappeared from the social circle she had once dominated. I heard through the grapevine that she had moved to a different state, trying to start over. The man she had been funding, Alistair Finch, was, I imagine, no longer in the picture. His interest in her was likely directly proportional to her access to my money. With the money gone, so was he. My life, in contrast, found a new, quieter rhythm. The large house, once a symbol of a shared life that had been a lie, slowly began to feel like my own. I filled the empty spaces, not with expensive art, but with things that brought me a sense of peace. Bookshelves filled with history books, comfortable, well-made furniture, and photographs of my children and my mother. I found a quiet satisfaction in the order I had created. My work took on a new meaning. I continued my consulting, but I also started a small, pro bono side project, offering my risk assessment services to nonprofit organizations and charities, the kinds of places my mother had supported. It felt like a fitting tribute to her, using my skills not just for profit, but for protection. My relationship with my children, which had been strained by Isabel's subtle campaign of parental alienation, began to heal. Without her influence, they started to see me not as a distant, boring father, but as a source of quiet strength and stability. We started having Sunday dinners, a tradition that had died years ago. One evening, my daughter, a sharp young woman who was in law school, was helping me clean up in the kitchen. "Dad," she said, pausing with a plate in her hand, "what you did, with the trust, with everything, it was brilliant, a masterclass in strategic It was just a contingency plan," I said, shrugging. "Something I should have had in place years ago." She looked at me, a new respect in her eyes. "Most people don't live their lives like that. They don't plan for catastrophic failure." "They should," I said. "Every system has vulnerability. The trick is to know where they are before someone else decides to exploit them." A few months ago, on the second anniversary of my mother's death, I went back to the cemetery. I stood before her grave, but the feeling was different this time. The raw grief had softened into a warm, quiet sense of gratitude. Her final, painful lesson had been her greatest gift to me. It had forced me to open my eyes, to reassess my own life, to find the cracks in my own foundation, before the whole structure came down. I had honored her memory not just by mourning her, but by learning from her, by being prepared. In my study, on my desk, I keep a single framed document. It's not an award or a diploma. It's the first page of the Nightingale Family Trust Agreement. It's a simple, dry, legal document, full of technical jargon, but to me it is a work of art. It is a symbol of a fortress I built, not of stone and steel, but of foresight and logic. It is a testament to the fact that the quietest man in the room is not always the weakest. Sometimes, he is the one who has already run the calculations, assessed the risks, and prepared for the storm. He is the one who knows the true value of a solid foundation. And when the storm finally passes, he is the one who is left standing.